Hey guys, tonight we will reveal a horrifying secret about the one woman brave enough to keep both Henry VIII and the Tudor dynasty awake at night. Picture the scene. A 67-year-old woman, frail and gaunt, with every drop of sweat weighed down by years of torment, takes each deliberate step toward the cold execution block. As the axe's blade hovers, it seems the end has come, but Margaret Pole stares unflinching at the executioner without a hint of submission. She refuses to kneel or beg for mercy. Instead, she dares him to personally take her life. What follows is a gruesome spectacle of 11 axe blows worthy of a gory horror film, leaving every witness horrified. What inner strength could propel a woman in her 70s to face such brutality? How did she become the greatest rival of the most notorious king in Europe? The mystery of Margaret Pole's unwavering resolve and faith will be unveiled shortly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your local time zone. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine this. On a gloomy morning at the Tower of London, the courtyard lay silent beneath a blanket of grey clouds. Lady Margaret Pole, a 67-year-old woman, frail from years of imprisonment, was escorted to the execution block in the centre of the square. Each slow step she took seemed heavy with the weight of her fate. When the executioner commanded her to kneel, Margaret did not flinch. She stood erect, eyes unwavering, and addressed the young man with a tone both dignified and mildly mocking. "If you wish to behead someone who has not betrayed her country, then do it yourself." Her words struck like a challenge, causing the inexperienced executioner's blade to falter and miss its mark repeatedly. The atmosphere was taut as a wire, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the battlements and the steady beat of Margaret's heart. Then the axe swung first pinked her shoulder instead of her neck, sending a spray of vivid red across the stone platform. Blow after blow rang out, second, third, fourth each strike, echoing like a tolling bell of doom. Finally, after 11 savage swings, Margaret Pole fell, her life ending in a scene reminiscent of a horror movie, drenched in both blood and sorrow. Why would a woman nearing 70, seemingly spent of strength, dare to face such brutality head-on? The answer lies deep in her history and in her bloodline. Margaret Pole was no obscure noble. She was born the daughter of Duke George Plantagenet and Isabel Neville, carrying in her veins the distinguished blood of the Plantagenet dynasty, a lineage once ruling England until the Tudors toppled them. Thus, Margaret stood as a silent but potent threat to the Tudor claim. Moreover, Margaret had served as the steadfast right hand to Queen Catherine of Aragon, the first gracious consort of Henry VIII. She witnessed Catherine's marriage crumble, witnessed the Roman Church's power wane in England as the Tudors severed ties with the papacy, a conflict that cost 2 queens their lives. Her unshakable Catholic faith and close friendship with Catherine compelled her to publicly oppose Henry's divorce and his break from Rome. To the Tudor court, such opposition equalled treason. Margaret was no longer a gentlewoman. She became the final keystone threatening the new dynasty's legitimacy. Her unwavering resolve and the gruesome conclusion of 11 axe blows transformed her into a rallying symbol of Catholic martyrdom. That tragic death etched her memory into the nation's heart, elevating Lady Margaret Pole from a pariah noble to a hallowed figure later venerated by the Church of Rome. Thus, amid the damp shadows of the Tower of London, the name Margaret Pole became immortalized as the woman bold enough to defy England's most ruthless power. Now, let's settle in for what comes next. Margaret Pole was born on the 14th of August, in the year 1473 at Farleigh Castle, towering amid dense woods and a lazy river. She was the firstborn daughter of Duke George Plantagenet brother to King Edward IV and Isabel Neville of the formidable Neville clan. Royal blood coursed through her veins. Niece to King Edward, cousin to Richard III, and aunt to Elizabeth of York, whose marriage would later end England's Wars of the Roses. Though born into privilege, her childhood was scripted by political intrigue rather than personal joy. When Margaret reached the tender age of 3, tragedy struck. Her mother, 25-year-old Isabel Neville, died suddenly just over 2 months after giving birth to baby brother Richard. That loss ignited a chain of sorrow. Duke George, half believing and half suspecting foul play, accused lady-in-waiting Anchor Twinho of poisoning his wife, coerced her confession, and ordered her execution in 1477. Soon thereafter, infant Richard passed away at 2 months old, leaving Margaret with only 2 farewell letters to her mother and her brother, and a heart broken by early grief. Political calamity soon compounded personal loss. Duke George conspired against his brother, King Edward IV. When the plot was unearthed, Edward ordered his brother's execution for treason. Margaret, then about 5 years old, bore witness to her father's beheading, her brother's disappearance, and her mother's silent grave. She and her surviving brother Edward became orphans, cast adrift in a ruthless court where power was enforced by blood and steel. Upon turning 10, Margaret saw yet another upheaval. King Edward IV died, Richard III ascended the throne, and stripped Margaret and Edward of succession rights. Less than 2 years later, at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, Henry Tudor defeated Richard III, crowned himself Henry VII, and founded the Tudor dynasty. Though he married Elizabeth of York, Margaret's sister, to heal the divide, lingering distrust remained. Henry VII understood that the Plantagenet line, especially Edward and Margaret, held legitimate claims that could spark opposition. Thus, despite their royal birthright, the young cousins were kept under strict watch. In that precarious environment, Margaret grew up under searing political pressure. The girl dreamed of open gardens in which to dance, yet her reality was one of successive losses. Mother, baby brother, father, and later, the execution of Edward. These relentless hardships seeped into her very being, forging unshakable resolve and iron loyalty. Tutored rigorously in Latin, medieval French, Old English, and religious classics by seasoned instructors, she nevertheless learned her greatest lesson through adversity: the power of resilience. Margaret Pole's early years stand as a testament to the strength of the human will. Though her childhood was stained by tragedy and her birthright placed her at odds with the ruling house, she maintained her faith and dignity. That unwavering spirit would guide her through the dramatic chapters to follow, proving that no earthly authority can conquer a heart tempered by trials of fire. So, after the tragedies of her childhood, Margaret Pole grew up amid intricate power plays. Upon reaching marriageable age, she was wed not for love, but for politics to her Tudor cousin Richard Pole, a loyal servant to the king. Together they welcomed 5 children: Prince Henry, young Arthur, daughter Elizabeth, little Reginald, and Geoffrey. Picture Margaret, ever the dignified noblewoman, cradling infants yet tending to noble duties, a portrait of maternal grace in the midst of courtly storms. Fast forward to the year 1501, when fate smiled upon Margaret. King Henry VII appointed her as lady-in-waiting to the future Queen Catherine of Aragon, wife to Prince Arthur. Imagine, dear friends, the 2 noble women strolling in palace gardens, sharing wedding excitement and the bittersweet pangs of distance from home. Yet joy proved fleeting. A mere year later, Prince Arthur died, shattering aspirations and leaving Margaret bereft of her peaceful bridge into royal life. Her station and security suddenly felt as fragile as a rose petal. Shortly thereafter, in 1505, heartbreak struck again. Richard Pole succumbed to illness, leaving Margaret alone with 5 young children. Financial hardship loomed large. She borrowed a substantial sum from King Henry VII to cover funeral expenses. Under the crushing weight of bread and butter realities, Margaret reluctantly sent her 2 eldest sons to live with other noble families and entrusted young Reginald to the church's care. This heart-wrenching decision saved the family fortune, but cast a long shadow over her lifelong bond with her children. Then came 1509, the year Henry VIII ascended the throne and married Catherine of Aragon, Margaret's old friend. A door reopened at court. Margaret regained her standing, reclaimed her late brother's estates for a modest fee, and commissioned the building of Warrington Castle, her new emblem of stability and power. Through deft manoeuvring, she rose to become England's 5th wealthiest noble by 1538, despite the whirlwind of personal loss and political upheaval she'd endured. Yet, the sweet fruits of fortune withered quickly. King Henry VIII's dissatisfaction brewed as Catherine remained unable to bear him a lawful son, the prize he coveted above all else. In this turbulent moment, Margaret found herself caught in a cruel paradox. Devoted to her dearest friend, she could not stay silent as the court pursued divorce and broke from the Roman Church. Her vocal opposition to annulment and schism drew the king's ire, marking the start of her final tragic chapters. Chapters rife with heartbreak and drama yet to unfold. The truly tragic turning point came when Henry VIII, obsessed with a male heir, sought to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. In 1533, when the Pope refused to grant the annulment, Henry boldly severed ties with the Roman Church, proclaiming himself supreme head of the Church of England and enacting the Act of Supremacy. This audacious move was nothing less than a slap in the face to every Catholic, including Margaret, devout in faith and loyal to Catherine. In a manner typical of court intrigue, Margaret publicly condemned Anne Boleyn, the king's new wife, as the source of all upheaval, her words stinging like arrows through the hushed corridors of power. Henry, long suspicious of Margaret, seized upon her outspokenness as proof of disloyalty. Yet the most crippling strike came from Margaret's own bloodline. Reginald Pole, her youngest son, sent to the Church's care now a cardinal, openly denounced the king as a usurper, murderer, and enemy of Christ. His scathing denunciations were a direct challenge to royal authority, giving the Tudor court every justification it sought to annihilate the Pole family. In 1536, the Pilgrimage of Grace uprising erupted in northern England against the king's religious reforms. Reginald was deemed the spiritual heart of the rebellion, sending shockwaves through Henry's government. Swiftly, Margaret's second son, Geoffrey Pole, was arrested and subjected to brutal torture. Under relentless agony, Geoffrey named Henry Courtenay, an old friend of the king, as co-conspirator. Courtenay was executed without delay, followed soon by the execution of Henry Pole, Margaret's eldest son. Tragedy upon tragedy. Margaret herself was ordered, arrested, and confined to the residence of William Fitzwilliam for a 3-day interrogation marathon. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, accused her of possessing a tunic embroidered with the 5 wounds of Christ, presenting it as irrefutable evidence of her continued loyalty to Rome. Rumours insist the tunic was surreptitiously planted by Cromwell to strip her of every last right, and ultimately, her life. Witnesses praised Margaret's manly spirit, but it mattered little against the iron will of Henry. Margaret's estates were confiscated a second time, granted to Sir Thomas Ridley, the king's private secretary. Geoffrey was pardoned, but Cromwell. So recently Cromwell fell from grace and lost his life to the very king he had served, a grim reminder of Tudor caprice. Thus, from the pinnacle of influence to prisoner in the Tower of London, Margaret Pole endured a sobering fall. For 2.5 years she was provided minimal comforts, food, warm clothes, scant assistance, yet her heart never faltered in its steadfast faith, and in memories of happier times with Catherine. Behind the damp walls of the Tower of London, Lady Margaret Pole's once vibrant presence faded in her tattered noble gown. Yet few realised that before her final descent, she had stood at the pinnacle of influence, amassing wealth and status under King Henry VIII. Rewind to the early 1530s, around 1530, when Margaret commissioned the construction of Warrington Castle, imposing ramparts, deep moats, and lush gardens. This fortress was more than a home. It symbolised her authority and deft stewardship. From the first brick laid to the final flourish of decor, Margaret oversaw every detail, proof she relied not on lineage alone, but on her own enterprise. In the ensuing years, she expanded estates and tithes the income from her Midlands coal mines ploughed back into trade partnerships in Venice, exporting English wool across Europe. By 1538, records showed Margaret as England's 5th wealthiest noble, rivaling the highest echelons of Tudor power. Her name carried weight in both court and countryside. Yet Margaret never let success dull her vigilance. Heartbroken at the lack of a male heir, Henry VIII grew fixated on annulling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. In 1533, when the Pope refused the annulment, Henry enacted the Act of Supremacy, severing ties with Rome and naming himself supreme head of the Church of England. Margaret, devout Catholic and Catherine's ardent friend, could not stay silent. She openly blamed Anne Boleyn, accusing the new queen of upending royal vows and betraying ancestral faith. Her sharp rebuke echoed through the halls of power. England's very soul is at risk as the king turns from the Church of Rome. This bold stance sent ripples of unease through Tudor circles. The situation escalated further when her youngest son, Reginald, sent to the church for financial reasons, rose to become a cardinal. He became the fiercest critic of his cousin Henry's reforms, denouncing the king as a usurper, murderer, and enemy of Christ. Cardinal Pole's fiery rhetoric crystallized the clash between secular might and spiritual authority. Margaret found herself crushed between loyalty to her son and an uncompromising court. She penned a heartfelt letter urging Reginald to desist, pleading as a mother fearful for his life. But Reginald stood firm, and by 1536, northern England had erupted in the Pilgrimage of Grace Rebellion, so named for its religious overtones. Reginald's influence was undeniable, and Henry's government took note. When the uprising was brutally quashed, reprisal was swift. Geoffrey Pole, Margaret's second son, was arrested and tortured mercilessly. Under excruciating duress, he named Henry Courtenay, the king's childhood friend, as a conspirator. Courtenay faced swift execution, followed soon by Margaret's eldest son, Henry Pole. In one fell sweep, Margaret lost 2 sons and the fragile alliance between her family and the crown. The final blow came in the seizure of her estates, confiscated a second time and bestowed upon Sir Thomas Ridley, Henry's private secretary. The Plantagenet line, embodied by Margaret, was definitively severed. From the heights of prosperity, she plummeted into destitution, preparing for her own grim journey into captivity, the prelude to her fateful execution. Thus unfolds the saga of Margaret Pole's rise and fall. From building the grand Warrington Castle and ascending the ranks of Tudor nobility, to confronting religious schism and witnessing her family torn apart. We will soon return to that fateful morning of May 27th, 1541, when Margaret delivered her final testament of faith and courage before the execution block, proof that an unwavering spirit can defy even the coldest of steel. On a gloomy morning at the Tower of London, the black clouds overhead seemed to foretell Margaret Pole's final chapter. In 1537, Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, accused her of possessing a tunic embroidered with the 5 wounds of Christ, a potent symbol of Roman Catholic defiance. Cromwell presented it as irrefutable proof that Margaret feigned loyalty to the crown while secretly plotting against Henry VIII's break with Rome. Many historians suspect the tunic was planted in her luggage, a cunning trap to extinguish the last vestige of Plantagenet power. Stripped of titles and estates, Margaret found herself imprisoned in the Tower's dank depths. For nearly 2.5 years, she endured house arrest, an upgrade over typical dungeons, but harrowing nonetheless. Provided with warm clothes, a simple stipend, and a few attendants at her request, Margaret maintained the trappings of royalty even in captivity. Yet those meagre comforts were but a thin veil over profound loneliness and the agonizing wait for her death sentence. Despite her fall from grace, Margaret's status allowed meetings with prominent inmates, including Henry Fitzroy, her grandson, and the king's illegitimate son. Behind barred windows, grandmother and grandson exchanged pained glances, 2 survivors of Tudor intrigue, bound by blood and tragedy. Though brief, those encounters underscored her isolation. The fortress's stones bore witness to fleeting connections, now forever lost to time. But the cruelest torment lay not in her cell's cold stones, but in the prison of anticipation. Margaret watched old allies and courtiers fall from favour, some executed, others disgraced. She mourned each betrayal, recalling the comrades she once aided, now complicit in her downfall. Through it all, she clung to her Bible, its pages worn, ink smudged, a constant source of solace and strength. Daily prayers for family and country became her lifeline, embodying an unshakable spirit. Then, on the 27th of May, in 1541, the long-awaited directive came. Her execution would occur within the hour. The seasoned executioner, the Tower's main man, was again unavailable. Rumour said he'd been summoned elsewhere. In his place stood a terrified youth, hand trembling as he hefted the rusty axe. Margaret ascended the scaffold as calmly as if entering her own drawing room. She refused to kneel, declined to place her head upon the block, and met the young man's gaze with composed resolve. "Do not tremble on my account," she whispered, her voice unshaken. Around her the hush was broken only by the distant murmur of crowds and the dull thud of her own heartbeat. The lad swung and missed her neck entirely, the blade slicing into her shoulder instead, and drenching the stone in scarlet spray. Witnesses gasped, yet Margaret uttered no cry. She simply breathed in the pain, a testament to her defiance. Swing 2, swing 3 followed, each stroke a jarring note in the symphony of her demise. The boy's exhaustion and inexperience prolonged the agony, forcing her to endure nearly every second of his fearful assault. 10 strikes passed before the 11th blow finally severed her life's thread. At the 11th blow, the axe found its mark. Margaret Pole exhaled her last breath, her body slumping to the ground as the crowd stared, stunned by the brutality of Tudor justice. Her death, in all its gruesome finality, transcended mere execution. It cemented her legacy as a true warrior of faith. Though she wielded no sword, Margaret faced death with unbowed conviction, steadfast until her last heartbeat. Her image, unyielding before the block, incorruptible in spirit, became a beacon for those oppressed by conscience. Margaret's physical demise did not erase her influence. In 1886, the Church of Rome beatified her, bestowing the title Blessed Margaret Pole. That solemn recognition honoured both her suffering and her moral courage, indicting Tudor cruelty and lauding her unwavering conscience. Despite the confiscation of her lands and the erasure of her name from court fabric, Margaret's story gained new life in stone and parchment. Warrington Castle, her stately fortress, stood silent, its halls echoing her brief resurgence of power. Scholarships in her name funded studies of history and theology, while towns, roads, and human rights groups across Europe invoked her example in the fight for religious freedom. Historians and YouTubers alike retell her tale, with varying tones, some witty, some somber, some analytical, but all converge on the same moral. Margaret Pole's will outlasted the sharpest steel. From noble courts to prison walls, from the scaffold to beatification, her life reminds us that tyranny may ravage the body, but cannot break the spirit. Margaret Pole's faith burned brightly through every trial, a guiding flame for all who seek justice and liberty. And so this chapter closes. Margaret Pole's unwavering stand at the execution block, and her immortal legacy beyond. Take a slow breath, relax, and prepare for our next exploration, the lessons in faith and courage drawn from her extraordinary life. Margaret Pole's tragic end was more than a political crime. It was a living portrait of sacrifice for faith and human dignity. Imagine this: Thomas Cromwell, the most powerful man after the king, the one who pinned the traitor label on Margaret with that embroidered tunic, was himself executed by the same king a year later, in 1540. Fate's ironic twist transformed the orchestrator into a victim of his own scheme. Though Margaret had already passed, her image lingered in the eyes of all who had witnessed her fate. She was more than a noblewoman condemned. She embodied the simple yet profound pain of standing by one's beliefs. In a world ruled by brute force, her quiet declaration, "Without faith, we are nothing," still echoes across centuries. Cromwell may have forced her toward the block, but Margaret's steadfast spirit shone so brightly, it illuminated the path for generations to come. Let us not forget, Margaret sacrificed not only for religion but for human dignity. She stood tall before the block, without a plea for mercy, without shameful tears. That image etched in paintings and pages of history still sends shivers through the spine, reminding us of her courage and stirring sorrow for humanity's tragedies. In a world where unchecked power can crush everything, Margaret stands as our reminder. Only unwavering loyalty to our principles, only undying ethics, can be our ultimate strength. Even when pressed to the brink of suffering, her resolve never wavered. She teaches us that when all doors slam shut, faith leaves the smallest crack through which light may enter. And the miracle is that, over 4 centuries later, Margaret Pole still lives in the hearts of humankind. Her name adorns institutes for religious history, human rights conferences, scholarships, and countless YouTube videos awakening conscience. Each time her name is spoken, humanity reaffirms, power can slay the body, but it cannot extinguish the spirit. Margaret Pole's journey was rife with contradictions. From a victim of courtly intrigue to a bold challenger of authority, she stood as a living witness to the brutal shifts of 16th century English politics. Looking back upon those blood-stained pages, it becomes clear Margaret was no weak woman. On the contrary, she embodied unbreakable conviction. No matter the dynasty, no matter how laws transformed, justice and human dignity endure. A less explored dimension is Margaret's relationship with her children. In financial crisis, she entrusted young Reginald to the church to secure their future. What began as prudent guardianship became fraught when Reginald grown led opposition to the king's schism. Margaret's anguished letter, "Stop before you bring ruin upon us all," reveals a mother's conflicted heart, torn between maternal fear for his life and helpless before his chosen cause. Their clash reflects the ageless tension between maternal love and political ideals, a dilemma she could never fully resolve. Yet the Pole tragedy transcends personal drama. It illuminates how Tudor power operated, swiftly extinguishing any perceived threat, even within the royal family. Henry VIII executed wives in rapid succession, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and purged advisors and comrades alike. Fear blanketed the court. Any raised head risked imprisonment or worse. In that chilling environment, Margaret's defiance was a rare act of nonconformity, costing her life. She chose to uphold truth rather than seek comfortable safety, and that choice fuels her solemn legend. Her mournful end did not bury her memory. 3 centuries later, in 1886, the Church of Rome beatified her, recognizing her as a Catholic martyr. This act went beyond honoring one woman. It affirmed the timeless value of courage and loyalty. Though the 16th century receded, Margaret's call still resonates. One's faith and honor cannot be erased, even when dynasties crumble. Margaret Pole lives on in chapels, in history books, in liturgy, and in the hearts of those who cherish religious freedom and human rights. Scholarships, universities, streets, and conferences bear her name. Devout Catholics revere her as an exemplar of steadfast faith, while historians celebrate her as the emblem of the fight for liberty against tyranny. From those grim chapters, Margaret Pole's story continues to inspire. Even in the darkest times, people can stand firm to defend what is right. She stands as a testament to tenacity, proving that the greatest beauty lies not in wealth or prestige, but in maintaining one's dignity until the last breath. So as you gently close your eyes, drifting off into a sleepy hush, let Margaret Pole remind you, in a life full of temptation and pressure, do not lose your conviction. Even a flickering candle in your heart can light the world. Closing those tragic pages, Margaret Pole's legacy transcends her personal ordeal to become a vivid cultural emblem. Her slender figure, fierce eyes locked on the execution block, defiantly confronting power, has been immortalized in countless paintings and stage dramas. Renaissance artists and modern directors alike cannot resist the magnetism of the 11 axe blows tale. Each strike a brutal testament to Tudor crimes and a portrait of unbroken spirit in the face of evil. In the religious sphere, Margaret was raised to martyr and blessed status, standing alongside history's great martyrs. In 1886, the Church of Rome formally honored her sacrifice as a declaration of support for religious freedom and a rejection of state monopoly over faith. Churches across England and Europe erected statues in her memory, calling on her as patron for those persecuted for their beliefs, lighting candles in prayer for her soul and for believers who will not waver. On the political and social stage, Margaret Pole's story resonates as a reaffirmation of individual liberty and the right to dissent. When power is abused, every citizen has the duty and the right to speak out, even if it costs them everything. Reflecting on Margaret's tragedy, we learn how vital conscience and moral courage are. Silence may protect the body, but only a voice of defiance preserves the soul. A poignant facet is her family relationship, especially with youngest son Reginald. In a bid to secure their finances, she sent him into the church, an act that, in the end, drove a wedge between mother and son. Her anguished letter, "Stop before you bring ruin upon us all," remains a living testament to the lesson. Safeguarding wealth does not guarantee the warmth of family bonds. When ideals soar above all else, even the bond between mother and child can fracture. In sum, Margaret Pole symbolizes the nexus of power, faith, and dignity. Her life, from princely affluence to utter loss, from a tragic death to posthumous exaltation, completes a historical circle. Power may shift, laws may change, but an indomitable spirit and unwavering loyalty to justice endure forever. As night falls, relax your shoulders, close your eyes, and let Margaret Pole's story lull you into dreams of a world where human will triumph over every oppression. Compared with the Tudor women who faced the block, Margaret Pole stands out for a crucial reason. She was not a queen or a wife of the king, but a distant cousin of royal blood. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were Henry VIII's direct consorts, beheaded for failing to deliver a male heir. Margaret was condemned for high treason because of her unwavering loyalty to the Roman Church and the Plantagenet legacy. All three suffered the cruelties of annulments and power plays, but while the fleeting queens endured the political spotlight, Margaret chose quiet defiance. She would rather lose her life than betray her principles. In modern literature and on screen, the character of Margaret Pole appears in historical novels, television dramas, and stage plays. Each work strives to capture that damp Tower of London, the leaden sky, the distant church bells, and her resolute figure before the block. Her 11 axe strokes, so cold and methodical paired with her fearless poise, have become iconic. Viewers often find themselves asking, could anyone stand unmoved until the very final blow as Margaret did? Looking back across time, Margaret's indomitable spirit paved the way for later religious struggles. The English Reformation conflicts, crusades, and modern European movements for constitutional and religious freedoms. She was a pioneer for the idea that sacrificing one's life to defend spiritual liberty is the highest nobility. That ethos radiated through global human rights movements, as people stood for conscience and faith in the face of oppression. On the family front, Margaret's relationship with her youngest son Reginald teaches us about maternal love and political idealism. Sending Reginald to the church for the family's financial security seemed wise, yet he grew up to lead opposition to the crown. Her anguished letter, "Cease before you bring our family to ruin," could not sway him, yet it stands as a testament to a mother's heartbreaking sacrifice. It poses the eternal question: can lofty goals, duty to family, or religious mission justify every personal cost? Sometimes blood ties and ideals simply cannot coexist. Ultimately, Margaret Pole proves that history is not written only by the victors. Henry VIII claimed victory, yet Margaret claims a place of honour in human memory. She reminds us that ideals, faith, and loyalty wield power mightier than any tyrant's sword. When the history books close, Margaret Pole remains the torchbearer for those seeking justice in the shadows of power. And so, we draw part 11 to a poignant close. A woman who was never queen, yet so formidable that even tyranny trembles at her name. Relax your shoulders, slowly close your eyes, and let the image of Margaret Pole, undaunted to her final stroke, carry you into dreams of a day when justice and freedom prevail. And it is precisely from those heroic moments that Margaret Pole's life reveals a depth beyond legend. A Plantagenet princess whose childhood concealed so many losses, a young woman rigorously educated in the royal library, then a steadfast wife and mother weathering the storms of court. Let us revisit the opening chapters of her story, from her noble lineage and her parents' dramatic fates, to her home with Richard Pole and their 5 children, to uncover the roots of the iron faith that forged Margaret Pole's unbreakable spirit. Now let's explore the origins of the Plantagenet line, where Margaret Pole was born amid grandeur and the echoes of tragedy. From her first steps at Farleigh Castle, under Duke George and Isabel Neville's roof, to the early losses that forged the iron will of this young princess. The Plantagenet dynasty began with King Edward III, who launched the 100 Years' War and solidified royal authority across England. Under Edward III, the Plantagenets extended their power from Cornwall to the Scottish borders. By the reign of Edward IV, their rule, though brief, commanded great respect. Duke George Plantagenet, Margaret's father, was Edward IV's younger brother, a key player in that royal power structure. Equally influential was the Neville clan hailing from Yorkshire. They were the hidden powerhouses of their era. Isabel Neville, Margaret's mother, was the daughter of Richard Neville, the famed Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, for his role in deposing and installing English monarchs during the Wars of the Roses. The marriage of George and Isabel unified 2 massive political forces, tipping the balance among competing factions in the kingdom. When George and Isabel wed, they were not only bride and groom but also ambassadors of a strategic alliance. Their union produced Margaret Pole, carrying a royal heritage and inheritance that could inspire rebellion or hope among Tudor opponents. Every move of the young princess was scrutinized, from servant whispers to court gossip, branding her as the Plantagenet heir, capable of reigniting opposition. Margaret's royal status shaped her childhood. At Farleigh Castle, she studied Latin, French, and family history under seasoned tutors. Yet alongside the lavish library lay lessons in intrigue and loss. Her mother's sudden death, her father's fall into treason, teaching her early that power carries perilous risks. Thus, Margaret's early years blended opulence with shadow, dazzling courtly balls alongside silent tears in dim corridors when the next dire message arrived. It was in those first moments that her resolute spirit was forged in the crucible of hardship. a journey we will explore in deeper detail in the chapters to come. Margaret Pole's childhood was a curious blend of gilded splendour and heart-wrenching tragedy. At Farleigh Castle she accessed a royal education, libraries brimming with Latin texts, medieval French, church histories, and chronicles of her Plantagenet ancestors. Seasoned tutors guided her through parchment, opening a world wider than the castle's cold stone walls. Yet amid these tomes, tragedy struck like a nightmare. At just 3 years old, Margaret lost her mother, Isabel Neville, suddenly leaving her daughter adrift in silent sorrow. There was no time to grieve before her infant brother Richard followed 2 months later. Soon after, her father, Duke George, was ensnared in a plot against his brother and executed for treason. The once glorious halls became tombs of unspoken grief. Margaret's early psyche was not merely sorrowful. She learned to hide tears behind velvet drapes, to bow her head and conceal fear in courtly rituals. By age 10, she moved from Farleigh to royal palaces with each shifting court. New ceremonies awaited her at every stop, and with them, the spectre of her family's portraits abiding in her memory. A bright spot emerged in her bond with her brother Edward, her surviving confidant. The two shared whispers over books, recited French verse in secret, and found solace amid the rose patches. Edward, though no older, became her companion and emotional anchor, easing her solitude in a potentially ruthless world. Those early losses did not break her. They forged her unyielding will. The young princess learned that knowledge was her weapon, faith her shield. Between candlelit study sessions in Farleigh's ancient library, Margaret discovered how to stand firm when life's storms gathered. It was in those formative days that she laid the cornerstone of the indomitable spirit she would later display on the execution block. When Margaret Pole reached marriageable age, the royal court buzzed with intrigue. Henry VII had secured his throne, yet Plantagenet claims still loomed as a threat. To strengthen alliances and reassure the realm, Margaret was wed to Richard Pole, a Tudor noble of distant kin. Their union was chess, not romance. Richard Pole proved a devoted husband, respected for both loyalty and wisdom. Through Margaret's eyes, he became more than a political pawn, he was a steadfast partner. Together they welcomed 5 children: Henry, Arthur, Elizabeth, Reginald, and Geoffrey. Each child embodied a blend of Plantagenet heritage and Tudor promise. Within the Pole household, Margaret's royal status came with real responsibilities. She managed their estates, signing tenancy agreements, overseeing harvests, and learned to wield her authority with care. She taught her children Latin and Roman hymnody, gently reminding them of their regal lineage. Married life, however, was far from serene. As Henry VIII succeeded his father, Margaret balanced family duties with royal demands. Whenever Richard was summoned away by the king, she faced dispatches of court intrigues or even wars, leaving her many sleepless nights. The first major challenge of this political marriage was safeguarding her children's futures. Rumours circulated that Margaret would use her offspring as leverage for the Plantagenet cause, so she tirelessly defended each child under watchful eyes, teaching them that true strength lies not in wielding the sword, but in preserving one's integrity. These lessons would guide her children for life. Despite midnight worries, Margaret nurtured a warm family haven. On summer evenings, she and her children would sing Latin hymns or share Plantagenet legends by the hearth. It was this simple happiness that fueled her resilience, an inner light that would later carry her through far greater tragedies. Thus concludes Part 14, Margaret Pole's Years as Richard Pole's wife, where political duty met maternal devotion, forging the spirit of a true Tudor matriarch. Following her political marriage, Margaret Pole had the opportunity to serve as lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, the wife of Prince Arthur. At that time, Arthur embodied Tudor hopes, and Margaret was chosen as the princess's trusted confidant. This chance allowed her to witness royal life firsthand, learning to glide gracefully, bow in perfect rhythm, and interpret every subtle gesture of court etiquette. Margaret and Catherine quickly became close friends, sharing the highs and lows of court life. The excitement before the wedding gave way to heartbreak when Arthur fell ill. When the young prince died just a year later, Margaret wept openly alongside Catherine, 2 noble women suddenly bereft of their peaceful bond. That shared grief deepened their friendship and taught Margaret the true value of loyalty. Arthur's death and the shattered marriage affected Margaret's standing at court. After Henry VII's death and Henry VIII's succession, Margaret was summoned back to serve Catherine, now Queen. This new position brought her from Farley's seclusion to the very heart of royal decisions. However, intimacy with the Queen also sparked her first clash with royal interests. When Henry VIII expressed frustration that Catherine bore no male heir, Margaret overheard the whispered criticisms. At a grand feast, she politely confronted Anne Boleyn. True respect and honour are not measured by the number of court antics or unborn princes. Though delicate, the remark clearly defined the boundary between personal loyalty and Tudor politics, foreshadowing the trials ahead. In her new role, Margaret savoured political prestige, while also tasting courtly cruelty. Her bond with Catherine fueled her initial enthusiasm, but also placed her at a crossroads. Stand by her friend, or by Tudor protocol. When Henry VIII ascended the throne, Margaret Pole experienced an extraordinary revival. In 1509, she reclaimed her brother Edward's estates confiscated in his youth after his treason. This restoration wasn't mere land titles. It was her chance to rebuild royal influence and standing. Proving her capability, Margaret commissioned the construction of Warrington Castle, a grand fortress with thick walls, deep moats, and stately gardens. She personally oversaw every detail, selecting masons, importing limestone, and designing Tudor-style chambers. The castle served not only as her residence but as the operational hub for her estate, and a testament to her managerial vision. Margaret's income streams diversified impressively. Vast Midlands farmlands yielded wheat and livestock, while a newly exploited coal mine supplied the royal hearths and neighbouring villages. Additionally, she invested in the profitable wool trade with Venetian merchants, capitalising on English fleece's high demand across Europe. Through strategic diversification and tight oversight, Margaret Pole rose to become England's fifth richest peer by 1538. She wasn't merely a noble name, she embodied adaptability during turbulent times. The lesson from her success: in changing circumstances, leadership finesse and strategic foresight determine longevity. Margaret embraced challenges, seizing every opportunity to restore her family's fortunes from grains to castle stones. That's why, amidst Tudor upheavals, she maintained her status as a top-tier magnate before the next tragedies loomed on her path. Amid Tudor-era political upheaval, Margaret Pole's greatest conflict was the religious crisis. In 1533, Henry VIII enacted the Act of Supremacy, severing ties with the Roman Church and proclaiming himself supreme head of the Church of England. It was a historic turning point. "This realm of England is mine own proper church," the king declared, forcing clergy to vow allegiance to the crown over the Vatican. Margaret did not hide her stance. In a hushed private audience near Westminster Abbey, she spoke calmly but firmly. Marriage is a vow before God, not to be undone by a worldly decree. Her words tolled like a warning bell, making the court whisper in nervous suspense. The consequence was clear. Thomas Cromwell placed her under intensified watch, and her royal favour began to wane. Meanwhile, her youngest son Reginald, sent to the church as a boy, rose rapidly through ecclesiastical ranks. By 1537, Cardinal Reginald Pole stood out in Rome, wielding his position to publicly denounce Henry as a usurper and enemy of the faith. His outspokenness further strained his bond with his mother, caught between admiration for his conviction and dread for his safety. Margaret's anguish surfaced in a heartfelt letter she penned at Warrington Castle. "My dearest son, think of our family's safety before embarking on this storm. I cannot bear another loss, even for the noblest cause." Despite her plea, Reginald remained steadfast, underscoring the painful tension between a mother's love and a son's ideals. In 1536, the Pilgrimage of Grace erupted in northern England. Tens of thousands of peasants, nobles, and clergy marched against the Act of Supremacy, demanding the restoration of ties to Rome. Cardinal Reginald became the spiritual heart of the rebellion, fueling hope among the faithful. Yet the Tudor regime responded ruthlessly. Leader Robert Aske surrendered only to be executed. Soldiers quashed the uprising with pikes and swords, leaving devastation in their wake. Not long after, Margaret's second son, Geoffrey Pole, was arrested and tortured, forced to denounce alleged conspirators. Geoffrey endured unspeakable agony, only to watch family allies struck down one after another. Her eldest son, Henry Pole, fared no better. He too faced the block. The Pole family fell from grandeur to ruin, stripped of lands and titles. The Tudor household that once offered security became a tomb for dashed hopes. Margaret, the mother who entrusted her son to the church for their future, found herself weeping in the Tower of London's dungeons. Through these events we see, when absolutist power clashes with faith, even the highest noble can be ensnared by politics. Margaret Pole's life vividly illustrates the struggle between conscience and authority, maternal love and moral conviction, showing that religious conflict permeates individual hearts and homes as much as thrones and courts. Thus concludes Part 17. The religious schism that tore Margaret's world apart and forever reshaped the fate of the Pole dynasty. Close your eyes for a moment, feel that clash of power and faith, and prepare for our next chapter, her years of imprisonment and inner fortitude. In 1537, Margaret Pole finally fell into the snare laid by Cromwell. One foggy morning, Tudor troops stormed Warrington Castle with an order for her immediate arrest. She was escorted to the Tower of London, its thick stone walls already waiting. Over the next 3 days, interrogators stripped her of titles, forced her signature on a confession, and officially declared her stripped of all royal privileges. The Tower's noble accommodations were a cruel euphemism for bare minimum comforts. She received a thin blanket, a woolen gown for warmth, a few coins to buy Bibles and extra food, and even a fellow prisoner to serve her. It sounded merciful, but anyone confined within damp, shadowed walls knows. Every breath feels like a loss of liberty. In that endless darkness, Margaret faced the torment of awaiting execution. She missed her mother, her brother, her husband, and her 5 children scattered across the realm. Each passing day brought new losses: freedom, honor, and the dread of the unknown. Only her Christian faith anchored her. Nightly Bible passages lit her soul like a guiding flame, preventing her from drowning in desolation. Occasionally, the king's veneer of mercy appeared in rare visits. Her grandson, Henry Fitzroy, the king's illegitimate son, was allowed to glimpse her momentarily. Margaret saw in his innocent eyes a quiet sorrow born of courtly suspicions. In their silent hand-clasp, they reaffirmed bonds that no intrigue could sever. Gradually, Margaret prepared for her final hour with serene composure. She penned farewell letters to her children, urging each to uphold faith and dignity. She sat in quiet prayer, softly singing hymns that soothed her fears. The iron will forged in childhood at Farleigh Castle now tempered the resolve of a woman about to face the block. Thus, her descent into the Tower was not merely a public display of brutal power, but a crucible for her soul, shaping the steadfast spirit she would bring to her death. Margaret Pole was not passively awaiting doom. She was preparing to embody unyielding faith until her final breath. After her imprisonment, Margaret Pole's legacy exploded into every facet of culture, from art to religious veneration to modern human rights movements. Her figure, slim, silver-haired, standing tall before the block, etched itself indelibly in public memory. Renaissance painters captured her in their canvas, Princess at the Block, centering on her resolute gaze and graceful posture. On stage, actresses don flickering spotlights to portray her trembling yet determined voice, haunting audiences each time they whisper, "I will not kneel." In contemporary cinema, filmmakers frequently recreate the 11 strokes, the clash of steel on bone, droplets of crimson pooling on damp stone. Amid these visceral scenes, Margaret remains emblematic of defiance, of the ready-to-die unbowed spirit. Directors often bathe her face in harsh light, as if to remind viewers that tyranny may slay the body, but it cannot extinguish the flame of resolve. Religiously, she was beatified by the Church of Rome in 1886, placing her among the great martyrs. Churches across England and Europe installed statues and shrines to Blessed Margaret Pole, considering her patroness for those persecuted over conscience. Her feast day draws worshippers and visitors alike, not just to honour history, but to seek spiritual solace. On the human rights front, Margaret's name now headlines campaigns defending religious freedom and conscience rights. Organisations like Justice for Conscience and Writers at Risk adopt her image. Their posters superimpose her silhouette against a Gothic courtroom, emblazoned with "Faith cannot be fettered." Scholars continuously delve into her case. Margaret Pole illuminates the tension between law and conscience. Articles in religious and human rights journals cite her as a classic study in right to moral speech versus Authoritarian law. International women's history conferences often host sessions titled Margaret Pole and Feminine Resistance Under Tyranny. On YouTube, history channels recount her story in whispered narratives. Listen for the wind through the tower. Margaret's spirit speaks. Comments abound praising her courage and the lesson. Uphold your dignity, even when death is near. In sum, Margaret Pole's heritage transcends books and museums. She lives on in painting, theatre, film, in churches, and as a rallying emblem for human rights. Every time the name Blessed Margaret Pole is uttered, it echoes. The unbreakable spirit and unwavering fidelity to justice are ageless messages for anyone seeking truth amid the shadows of power. And that brings us to the end of Margaret Pole's remarkable journey from Plantagenet glory through Tudor tragedies to her unwavering final stand and immortal legacy. If you're still awake, relax your body, close your eyes, and let this story lull you into a peaceful sleep. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest and greatest historical tales. We'll keep bringing you new, fascinating videos. See you next time. Sleep well and dream of quiet heroes like Margaret Pole. Good night. You saw